Hello, and welcome to the first episode of what I think might be a sequence of discussions about how I wrote one of my poems, where it came from, and how it got published. I'm David Anthony Sam, and this is an episode of what I'm calling the biography of a poem. The first poem came from my readings in the early mid 1970s of popular discussions of the latest developments in particle physics and the new physics. One of the books I read was Gary Sukov's The Dancing Woolly Masters. And there were a number of sections of the book, discussions that, as we said back in the late 60s and early 70s, blew my mind. Now, obviously, this is a verbal discussion of physics, and physics is written mostly in the language of mathematics. And while I did take 1 year calculus, I cannot read that language. So I have to depend on translators, people who I hope understand and can accurately and successfully transfer that to me. Well, whether it was in The Dancing Woolly Masters or one of the other books that I was reading at the time, I happened upon an analogy of how physicists use particle accelerators to try to understand the very basic, smallest elements of our world, of our universe. They sail these particles at high rates of speed into each other, and they explode. And at the time, they captured it in cloud chambers, misty chambers where the particles could light up and show themselves, and high-speed photo is taken. There's other ways that they do it now. But the analogy was trying to understand how a clock works by banging two of them together and then looking at the parts that fall out. Well, that led to the writing of a poem. But there was something else behind it too. Throughout my life, I had always been troubled by what it was I wanted to do, what I wanted to be when I grew up. There were so many things I was interested in. Two big things were literature, writing, poetry, fiction, whatever, and sciences. I got a early interest in astronomy, geology from Mr. Keller in high school, in Belleville High School. So I also saw within me an apparent division of the logical, rational, and the emotional, intuitive. At the same time that I was reading this book, I was also reading translations of Taoist works, the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, and others, in which there basically was a kind of argument that a whole person is both logical and emotional, intuitive and rational. And from that, I came up with a poem that I titled He Reconciles, the Scientist and Poet. Now, getting that poem published was a different matter. It was published in fall of 1979, 5 years after I wrote it, by the Great River Review in Minnesota. At the time, I was running the music store in Belleville and writing poetry. Down the road, I became friends with the Bosio brothers, George and Jim Bosio. And George knew I wrote poetry and asked questions about it. And he decided to introduce me to a cousin of his, Emilio de Grazia, who happened to be editor of the Great River Review. He introduced me by phone, and we had a phone conversation from the restaurant to Minnesota. And Emilio said, "Send me some stuff. I can't promise anything, but send me some things." Well, Emilio ended up selecting 4 of my works, and it was the first time that multiples of my poems were published in one journal at one time. And Emilio spoke very highly of my work, and all writers need to hear that what they're doing is not a total waste of time. So he published those 4 poems in this issue. And he even nominated a couple that were included in an anthology. So now I'd like to read the poem itself to you. He reconciles the scientist and poet. Bent on quarks and omega minor, eyed by the cosmic bits that you eye on a photoplate, spy into infinity, you might deceive yourself. Breaking worlds into worlds, banging clocks together in infernal time till the gears spill like guts and streaks of white, you might spy yourself, peering back, or spin a beam around the rim of universe and see the back of your own head bent over a retreating horizon. Backed inside the whirling particles, you watch your watching in a gas darkly. Each time you break something, it only makes something, and the journey spills your guts like gears and tells you stories in different words. You might receive yourself coming back another way. So I did include some references here to what I was reading, also to puns like a glass darkly, here a gas darkly, and the analogy of banging clocks, looking at the gears to try to understand the clock, blowing up particles in order to try to understand the universe, became an analogy for trying to understand much else about oneself, one's life, and the world one lives in. So this has been an episode of the Biography of a Poem. I hope you'll join me again for another episode in which I'll discuss other published poems, where they came from and how they got published.